Okay, in this video we're going to talk about what's called the Raspberry Pi. Now, what is a Raspberry Pi? Well, my description of a Raspberry Pi is a $40 desktop computer, and you can see here it fits in your hand. I find it a very impressive device. It has a lot of the functionality of a desktop computer, and it's very inexpensive, you can see, and very small. You can use it in a lot of different ways. Now, to give you an idea of what you will get when you install the operating system and get this up and running, I have here a window, and it's on my Windows 10 main desktop computer. And inside this window is the desktop of the Raspberry Pi. I've got a Raspberry Pi connected on my network, and this is the desktop inside this window, and it's running on my main Windows 10 machine. And as you can see, it's very impressive. This is this monitor is a 27-inch 1920 by 1080 high-definition monitor, and the Raspberry Pi desktop is also very high resolution. It matches that resolution, and you can see the desktop looks very much like Windows. It's got some menu stuff up here on the top, and it's got some like a Bluetooth here. It's got network configuration, audio. It's got a wastebasket down here. And in fact, this presentation, these slides, are a Microsoft Office PowerPoint slide presentation that I moved over to my Raspberry Pi, and I'm running it on the Raspberry Pi. So it is a full-fledged operating system that has a lot of functionality, very much like Microsoft Windows. So first I want to talk about what actually does this Raspberry Pi include, what features does it have, and then after that we'll talk about how to get this up and running, how to connect it, how to configure it, how to load the operating system, and how to get it running the way I have it here. Now, what we're going to talk about is the latest model of the Raspberry Pi, which is Raspberry Pi 3 Model B, and as of the end of 2016 it's the latest version. On this board, this small board here, it has all of these features. It has this little chip here is a 1.2 gigahertz 64-bit quad-core CPU, which is very impressive. That's what runs this Raspberry Pi. It also includes a desktop operating system like you saw here, a full desktop operating system, and that is called Linux. And it is the Raspbian version designed specifically for the Raspberry Pi. And it has Pixel, which is the actual GUI here for the operating system. So if you haven't heard of Linux, I've got another video or a couple of videos in this channel that explain the differences between Windows 10 and Linux, a couple of Linux versions. But Linux has been around for many, many years. It's been around for decades. And Linux is a very, very popular operating system, even though you may not have heard of it. It is used on many servers throughout the world because it is a very lean and very tight operating system that doesn't take a lot of resources. And it's also used, it's the basis of all of the Android devices. So Linux is extremely popular. And this is very popular for a small device like this because it uses very little memory, and we'll talk about that in a bit. It also includes a wireless LAN, and you can see here, you go up to the networking, I've got an Ethernet 0 configured, and I've got a wireless LAN, which I don't have set up, but right on this board it's got an Ethernet. You see this Ethernet port, you just plug in your Ethernet. And it's also got wireless LAN. Now, we mentioned it's got RAM. It's got 1 gigabyte of RAM, which is somewhat impressive. Although if you're a Windows 10 or Windows user, you may say, well, 1 gigabyte of RAM for a desktop operating system is pretty small. And yes, with Windows it is, because Windows you're going to need, especially for 64-bit, you're going to need at least 2 gigabytes. I think you need more like 4 or more than that for really using Windows, but 1 gigabyte seems awfully small. You can't really run Windows 64-bit in 1 gigabyte. However, with Linux, and this is one of the reasons why Linux is so popular, you can run Linux on a very, very small amount of memory, and I'll show you here I've got the task manager for this Linux, for my Raspberry Pi, up and running. And you can see here it's only using 216 megabytes of memory to run this Raspberry Pi. Now, my Windows 10 here in the background is using about 4 gigabytes right now. Now, I've got some applications running, but even without those, it's going to need at least 2 or 3 gigabytes. So you can see that it's only got 1 gigabyte of RAM, but for Linux, that may be more than enough that you need. Now, it's also got 4 USB ports, USB 2.0 ports, and you can see right here, we've got 2 ports stacked on top of each other, side by side, so that's 4 ports. It also has an HDMI port for a monitor. So as with any standard LED or LCD monitor, you have an HDMI port, which is high resolution, just like this monitor I'm using here, 27-inch, 1920 by 1080. You can plug that right into the Raspberry Pi and get this high resolution screen. It also includes Bluetooth, and you can see up here, you've got Bluetooth. You can connect to Bluetooth. Now, I'm not a big fan of Bluetooth. I find it to be very slow, and there are other ways to transfer files and things. And honestly, I have trouble connecting far too often, so I don't bother with it. In fact, here I've tried to connect Bluetooth with my main desktop, and I've had problems, so I don't really use it. But it is there, and you may be able to use it. It also has here a 3.5 millimeter audio / composite video jack, so you can hook up your speakers or your headphone. And very importantly, it has a micro SD slot, and that's down here on the other side. And that's where you plug in the micro SD card that takes the place of a hard drive and a BIOS. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's very important that it has this micro SD slot. And it also includes on the card camera and display interfaces, which we won't talk very much about. Now, what doesn't it have? Well, again, this is Linux, and this is a special version for the Raspberry Pi called Raspbian. So you may not find much of your favorite software, and in fact, since it's only got 1 gigabyte of RAM, you may not be able to actually run a lot of major software applications. So just keep that in mind. You may have some challenges running a lot of your favorite software. Maybe not, but it depends on what you do generally for your software. It also does not have memory expansion. You are pretty much fixed with 1 gigabyte of RAM, which again may or may not be enough for you. Now, hard drive, no, it does not have a hard drive. However, it is surprisingly easy to connect a USB thumb drive in one of the USB ports here. And also, we will show a little bit later that you can plug in a SATA, a desktop SATA, like a terabyte or 2 terabyte drive into that USB port. And my experience is it will recognize it right away and be ready to go. So if you have external hard drive that can plug into a USB, you may be all set. It also doesn't have Windows OS. Of course, you couldn't, on 1 gigabyte, you probably couldn't even install Windows OS. But that also means that some of your applications and some of your Windows specific stuff isn't going to necessarily work. But again, that depends on your applications. And it also doesn't have a monitor, keyboard, and mouse. You're going to have to buy that or use some other method to access your Raspberry Pi. What does it have? Well, it has a lot of included software. Of course, we talked about this desktop operating system, which is Linux, the Raspbian. And it also has some programming applications, basically focused on Java and Python. And if you go up here, you can look at programming. You got some Java, Python stuff. So you've got some applications for programming. It also has an Office application, which is very much similar to Microsoft Office. It's got like Excel and PowerPoint equivalent versions. In fact, this Microsoft PowerPoint slide presentation was generated in Microsoft PowerPoint and moved over to Raspberry Pi, and I'm running it on this Office application called LibreOffice Impress. So it's pretty impressive. However, keep in mind, you may have some challenges. For example, something simple as fonts. Fonts, the base font in Microsoft Office PowerPoint is not included in Linux by default. So you have to go searching on the internet, you have to find the right font, and it's not licensed by Microsoft, so you have to find a version that is. And it took me a while just to get this PowerPoint application running because the fonts were wrong and everything was not centered and it was off. So keep in mind, yes, it does have some really nice applications, but they may not be compatible with your Windows. Now, it also has a internet browser, mail. It has some accessories like you'd find in Windows. It's got a calculator, file manager, image viewer, PDF, SD card, task manager, terminal, and a text editor like Notepad. And it's got some, you set your preferences. So it's very much like Windows in that it's got a lot of the similar functionality. Now, it also has, and we'll talk about these two things that are installed by default that can be very useful. It has a VNC server and an SFTP server. Now, what that allows you to do, for example, the VNC server allows you to do this, which I described before. I'm running Raspberry Pi in a window remotely over the network on my Windows 10 machine. So that functionality, that VNC server is already available on the Raspberry Pi. You just have to enable it by clicking a button. And you're able to grab the desktop operating system remotely and work with your Raspberry Pi like this. So it's very nice. Also with file transfer, we'll talk about this, where you can transfer files to your Raspberry Pi from my Windows 10 machine, for example. I can do a very simple file transfer. So it's got a lot of built-in functionality that's really quite surprising for something this small and inexpensive. Now, there's another feature that it has that is very, very popular especially in the hobbyist community and in education. And these are called the general purpose input-output or GPIO pins. Now, what are those? Basically, it allows you to interface this computer with the outside world. And you can automate things. For example, you can use this computer as a brain to automate a robot. Because this is a very small device, you can strap it to a robot and hook up to these pins, and you can automate the motors that cause the robot to drive, and you can automate cameras, you can automate all kinds of things. You can take inputs and outputs from the real world and automate them. So there is a huge community of people focused around this interface where people can automate things and do a lot of technical interfaces with the outside world. Now, keep in mind, this is not a heavy-duty industrial interface. These are very low voltage signals that are fairly limited in what they can do directly. You may have to get some other devices out here to be able to use these. These are like 3-volt signals on the analog inputs and outputs and digital. So just keep in mind, this is not a industrial quality device, but it can help you do a lot of things. Now, what else are you going to need to get this up and running? Well, the first thing I highly recommend is a power adapter. And here down the bottom, you can see the power adapter that you'll need. It's basically a wall adapter like any of your smartphone or anything else. And it is a micro USB. You plug it in the wall. The other end has a micro USB connector, and it delivers 5 volts DC and 2.5 amps. You do need this if you're going to use the Raspberry Pi with the USB ports and you're going to start plugging devices in. I really recommend you get this. It's very inexpensive. The other thing you definitely must have is a micro SD card. And that is going to hold your operating system. This card doesn't have a BIOS like a regular computer, so that's going to be, that functionality is going to be on this SD card. So you need a micro SD card with at least 8 gigabytes of memory. And I recommend that you get a card that already has the operating system installer on it. And that's called the Noobs, which is, I think, new out-of-box operating system installer. And if you have that on that SD card, then you just plug it in, plug in the power and boot it up, and it will automatically take care of installing the operating system, that Raspbian Linux, on the SD card for you, and it'll get you up and running right away. So I strongly recommend you get one with this already installed. And then you have a choice. Either you can buy a separate monitor, keyboard, and mouse to operate directly the Raspberry Pi, or you can do what I'm doing here, which is use virtual network computing for remote access. Like I've got here, I've got my Windows 10 machine accessing the Raspberry Pi in a separate window. So now, what is this all going to cost? Like I said, this board alone is about 40 US, which is really quite impressive. However, you're going to need more things, like I mentioned, to get up and running. You're going to need the adapter, you're going to need the SD card. Now, you can buy a starter kit that has those things plus some other things, some cables and some things that will help you to interface with this GPIO if you want to do any automation. And that will be about $90. So to get this up and running, you're looking at somewhere between $40 and $90, I think. And you should be all set to go. Much of the software, like the virtual networking, is free. So a lot of this stuff is free, but you will have to get some hardware to get this going. Now, assuming you're ready to get this configured, let's go through and explain to you how to step-by-step configure this so you can get up and running the way I've got it here on my Windows 10 machine. The first thing you're going to do is, like I said, this SD card. And you will get this SD card that looks like this. It's got this Raspberry logo on it. And that means it's got the Noobs Raspberry Pi operating system installer on it. But you're going to get this kind of big SD card, and you're going to look around here and you can say, wait a minute, this doesn't fit in any of the connectors here. Well, you have to realize that the micro SD that you're going to use for the Raspberry Pi is inside here. So you look around the edge and you see this little tab, and use your fingernail, you're going to pull out this little SD card here. And this SD card is what you'll use to plug into the Raspberry Pi. This big one you're not going to need. So once you've got that, you take out this SD card and you plug it into this end of the Raspberry Pi, which is the opposite end from the Ethernet connector and the USB connectors. And under here you'll see this little slot, and make sure you match up the pins on this SD card with the pins inside this connector and slide it in. And once you've got that, you need to connect your monitor, mouse, and keyboard. And you're going to need those three things just to get this thing configured initially. So plug in monitor, mouse, and keyboard. The mouse and keyboard go into the USB, and then the monitor will go into the HDMI. And then you can plug in your Ethernet cable. And once those are plugged in, you just take the adapter and you plug it in on the side here, the 5 volts, 2.5 amp adapter, the DC. You plug it in here, and that will boot up this Raspberry Pi. And you'll see on the monitor, you'll see it come up, the Noobs will start working, and it will give you the option to install this Raspbian operating system. And I think the first choice in the menu will be to install Raspbian. You just say yes, and it will go through and just follow the instructions, and it will do it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, once you've got that done, you should have this on your main monitor. Now, the next thing I want to warn you about is the Raspberry Pi does not have an on-off switch. So you might be tempted to just pull that power supply, and that's a no-no. You shouldn't do that. And the reason is, if you just unplug the power, it might damage your SD card. So you first need to shut it down, kind of like Windows, where you go in, you go to the menu, you start menu, shut down. You have to do the same thing. So the correct procedure, there's a couple ways you can do it. In this desktop, you can go up here, go to here and go to shutdown, and click that, and it will shut down your Raspberry Pi. Now the other way is, if you had an older version, you would have to go into this terminal window up here. And this terminal window is something you're going to have to get used to if you're going to use Linux, because a lot of Linux commands are not, or menu commands, you have to do manual commands like a command line and old DOS prompt. So you can go in here and type out this sudo space halt space dash H, and that will shut it down. Okay, so let's get out of here, type exit, EXIT, and so just keep this in mind. Don't just pull the plug, make sure you shut it down. Now, the other thing you need to know is by default, this latest version of the Raspberry Pi and the Raspbian operating system is set to automatically log in, and the username is PI and the password is Raspberry. And you can change that by going up to this menu. See this little Raspberry? That's the main menu. And you go into Preferences, and then you go into Raspberry Pi Configuration, and you'll get this window that pops up, and you go into System, and you go to Auto Login, and there's a check mark here, Login as User Pi. You also have the option to change the password. So I would suggest the first thing you do is you change the password to your own password instead of this default Raspberry. Also, you see the host name here. That's the name that you will give it as on the network to other devices. And then here you can deselect, so it doesn't automatically assign the username as Pi. You can put in your own username. So those are the things I'd recommend you do right up front. So once you've got that, the next thing I want to talk about is remote desktop access. Now, one option I mentioned is here's your Raspberry Pi, and you can go out and you can get, or maybe you have a spare monitor, keyboard, and mouse, and you can plug them into the Raspberry Pi and you can get it up and running. If you want to keep doing that, then that's fine. But let's say that you don't want to do that. And let's say you have another computer on the network that you want to access the Raspberry Pi from. So you don't want to have that. You want to access it using this other computer like I've got, where you bring up the desktop on another computer and you can use the keyboard, mouse, and monitor from this main computer. So there's a way to do that, and the way I'll show you is a way that I like and I've used for a long time, and that is called Virtual Network Computing, or VNC. And to do VNC, you basically connect your Raspberry Pi to a network, and here's the network router that goes to your internet service provider, and you have your two computers connected via Ethernet to the router, and on the Raspberry Pi you have what's called a VNC server software. And the nice thing about Raspberry Pi is it comes configured already with a VNC server software, and all you have to do is enable it. And then the main machine that's going to control the Raspberry Pi will need to have a VNC viewer software. Okay, so if you do that, you don't need the keyboard, mouse, and monitor. You can just do it remotely. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you want to do is to enable in the Raspberry Pi that VNC server. So we go the same thing as we did before. You go into Preferences, Raspberry Pi Configuration, and the window comes up, and you go to the Interfaces tab, and down here you'll see VNC. It will default, it will come up as disabled. Just click Enable and hit OK. And once you do that, the VNC server is ready to go on your Raspberry Pi. So now this is all set. You just need to go to your main application, your main Windows computer, and set that up. So how do you do that? Well, on my machine, as you can see over here, I have VNC Viewer set up. And the way I did that is I downloaded what's called the Real VNC Viewer. And you can go online, you can find Real VNC is the company, and they've been around they've produced a VNC viewer and server for many, many, many years. and they're very nice applications. I've been using them for many years. However, in 2016, they changed the way they provide these VNC tools. It used to be that the VNC viewer and server were standalone executables you download to your computer and that's it. You just run it. Now they have made it a cloud-based application. It's free, like it's always been, but is now cloud-based. Personally, I despise cloud-based applications. I much prefer the old, download the executable, you have control over it. Nobody has control over it but you. So the problem is, if you don't like the cloud-based application, that is like a version 6 of Real VNC. What you can do, I've got a version 5 that is the old standalone EXE. You can go online, you can find the old version 5 and download it. You may have to search a bit, but if you don't want the cloud-based, you can just download the EXE, the version 5. Otherwise, you're going to have to give them your email and you have to log in each time, and it's just, I just don't like it. So it's up to you, but anyway, it will give you this access to this VNC viewer on, in my case, a Windows 10 main machine. Now, in order for this thing to run, now I'm going to assume you just download it and you installed it. It's fairly simple to install. In order for this thing to access your Raspberry Pi, you first need to find out the IP address of your Raspberry Pi. And that's really straightforward. You go over here to your Raspberry Pi and you hover over this networking icon and you can see the first item, Ethernet 0, configured, and it has the IP address right there, 192.168.0.6, right up here. So remember that, 192.168.0.6, because you'll need that to run your Real VNC viewer. Now, go back to your, what you do is you go back to your, in my case, my Windows 10, my main machine, and I need to set up that connection to the Real VNC viewer. Now to do that, I'll show you here, I will add a new connection. I've already got a connection, but all you do is you type in the 192.168.0.6 and then hit connect, and it will ask you for your password, which should default to Pi, and, or user's Pi, and the password is Raspberry. Once you do that, you should get a screen just like this, and on your, in my case, the Windows 10 machine, you will get a screen just like this, and you'll be ready to access your Raspberry Pi. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind, that it will probably default, instead of having this nice 1920 by 1080 resolution, it might default to like a 640 by 480, very low resolution. So what you might need to do is go and change the resolution setting for this connection to the VNC viewer. Now this is a little bit, it's going to take a little bit of work, but it's not too difficult. Now what you're going to have to do, and this is one of the things about Linux, sometimes you have to open up a terminal window like a DOS command and type in some manual commands. So what you're going to have to do is on your Raspberry Pi, now let's assume you're back to your Raspberry Pi on your main monitor, you open up this terminal window, and in this window you're going to type this command right here, sudo leafpad/boot/config.txt. Now what does that mean? Well, sudo is a very common Linux command, and it means super user do. What is super user? That's basically the same as an admin privileges in Windows. So what it's saying is, as an admin, do this, and this is what's following. And you're asking it to open LeafPad, and LeafPad is the Linux version on the Raspberry Pi of Notepad, the standard text editor in Windows. So open LeafPad as an admin with admin privileges, which will allow you to edit this config.txt file. And this is the text file that will allow you to change the resolution for your VNC viewer. And you access it at the boot level /config.txt. So enter that and you will get, let me enter it now. So sudo leafpad /boot /config.txt. And you can see it now. It opens up this text editor. And now all you have to do is you have to scroll down to this section where it says HDMI group 2 and HDMI group and mode. Now, you'll notice a lot of these have hash marks in front of them, a lot of these commands. These are ready. If you want to enable any of these, you just delete the hash mark, because the hash mark is basically a comment. So all of these are commented and not enabled. But what you want to do is go down to this HDMI group and HDMI mode and change and delete the hash marks and change the numbers here. In my case, I've changed it to 2, which you'll want to change it to 2, and I've changed it to 82 to define 1920 by 1080. Now you can put those same numbers in and hit File, Save, and you should save it okay. Now, if you don't want 1920 by 1080, you can look on the internet for the HDMI mode settings. Depending on what resolution, there's different numbers in here. But I think you get the idea. You just change those settings and you should be all set to go. So let's get out of this. And the next thing you have to do, once you've got that done, make sure you save that. Then you just need to reboot the Raspberry Pi for the changes to take effect, and you should be all set. And the next time you run this VNC viewer, you'll get this nice 1920 by 1080. Okay, so again, you're starting to see some of the things you need to do in Linux. Sometimes you have to use these command line commands to get stuff done. So it's a little bit different from Windows. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is configuring external hard drives. And generally, they have to be USB interfaces. Now, surprisingly, like I said, this Raspberry Pi, the operating system, is set so you can plug in, for example, a thumb drive, like this thumb drive right here, which is the one I use. You can plug that into one of those USB ports, and the Raspbian operating system will immediately recognize it and throw up a window that says, what do you want to do? Do you want to open this in File Manager? So we can look here and see that I've already got a USB. I've got this USB device, this thumb drive plugged in, so I can open up this little icon here, which is File Manager, very similar to Windows. And I go here, go down to this where it's got the root directory, and I go in here, and the way I get to it is I go to Media, Pi, and I can see here's my USB thumb drive. And I can now access what's on that USB thumb drive by just clicking on it. I can also right-click on it and add it to bookmarks. Okay? Then if I do that, then instead of having to go searching next time I get on, I just go to bookmarks, and it will appear here on the bookmark. So let's do that. I'll right-click, add to bookmarks, and now there it is on my bookmark. So it's a shortcut to get to that drive. So fairly simple to get that configured. You just plug it in and it's ready to go. Now, surprisingly, you can do the same with a SATA hard drive using a SATA interface, which is a high-speed 1 terabyte or 2 terabytes or however big you want. You can access using your Raspberry Pi by using what's called a USB docking station. And basically allows you to plug in your hard drive into this docking station, and it has a USB, in this case a USB 3 cable that plugs into that USB port on the Raspberry Pi, and you can do the same thing and it will recognize the SATA hard drive. And you can see here I've got, if I go in here and I look at my bookmarks, I've already bookmarked, and I've got my SATA drive. I've got two partitions on that 1 terabyte hard drive, A and B, and they're all set to go. So surprisingly, I just plug it in, same as this thumb drive, and it recognizes it, and it's ready to go. Now keep in mind, if you do this, you're going to need a self-powered device like this docking station, because you can't run devices like this using your 2.5 amp wall adapter. So keep that in mind. But you can access hard drives, big hard drives, using your Raspberry Pi. Now, the other thing you might want to do is file transfer. Now, file transfer is like if I have on my Windows 10 machine, I want to transfer files to the Raspberry Pi. For example, I did this presentation in PowerPoint, and I want to transfer it over the network to my Raspberry Pi. Well, it would be nice if your real VNC could do that, you know, because you're connected using real VNC, you're connected to your Raspberry Pi. Can't you just transfer files? Well, no. The free or home version of real VNC doesn't allow you to transfer files. You need to get the paid version like the Enterprise Edition. However, there is a what's called an FTP client, a very nice application that you can use in a client-server method that will allow you to transfer files between your Raspberry Pi and your main machine over the network. And again, the Raspberry Pi will be the server, and surprisingly, it already has on the Raspberry Pi Raspbian Linux operating system, it already has an FTP, and this is secure FTP, SFTP. It already has an SFTP server application available that you just need to enable. And then on the main Windows machine, you just need to download a free client application, and I'm using FileZilla, and we'll talk about how to do that. And then once you've got that, you can easily transfer files back and forth. So how do you do that? Well, again, we're going to use what's called SFTP, which is an SSH, Secure Shell File Transfer Protocol. And this is something that's been around forever and ever and ever, but it allows you to securely transfer files over a network. And like I said, Raspberry Pi 3 has the SFTP server installed. You just need to enable. How do you do it? Well, the same as we did before. You go into the menu, you go into Preferences, Raspberry Pi Configuration, and you go to Interfaces, and right next to the VNC that we enabled, there's SSH. Okay, that's normally disabled. Just click Enable, like I have it, and you're all set to go. So now that your Raspberry Pi is ready, all you need to do is go on to your Windows, your main Windows machine, or whatever machine you're using, and install an SFTP client. And again, I'm using FileZilla, and you can search. It's a free application. It's very nice. And just download it and install. And here I've got what you'll get once you start it up. And I'll show you how to access your Raspberry Pi. But here's FileZilla. And basically here on the left-hand side, I've got my main Windows 10 machine that's got the, it shows the desktop and it shows all the file structure, the file manager. On the right side is the remote machine. Now I'm not connected yet to the Raspberry Pi, but to do that, I go up here and I go to File, Site Manager. And here's where you add a new site. And that basically means a new server that you want to connect to. So what you do is you click here on New Site. Now I've already done that. And you click on that and it asks you for the host name. Now remember, we hovered over this and this network, and we said it was 192.168.0.6. So just enter that in there. Choose as the protocol SFTP, Secure File Transfer Protocol. Choose Login Normal, login type, and then put in enter the user, which is Pi, and then your password, and you should be all set to go. So you click Connect, and it's trying to connect, and there it goes. It shows the remote site is your Pi, and it shows all of your directory structure, and there's your media. Remember, we had the media. and we can see our thumb drive or SATA hard drive. So right there, now all I have to do is drag and drop to bring files over, and it is very, very nice. And not only can you use it for Raspberry Pi, but any other network computer. So you don't have to go through the Windows. It makes it much easier to transfer Windows without the home groups and all that, and any other Linux machines. It's a very nice way to do it. So I strongly recommend you consider doing that. So that's about it. That should help you to get up and running with your Raspberry Pi. If you need any more assistance or you want to investigate any more, there is tons and tons of resources on the internet for videos and projects. And you can go to raspberrypi.org, which has a lot of tutorials and a lot of really good information on the Raspberry Pi. So hope that helps, and have a really great day. Thanks.